The story of Elliot Mercer. Elliot Mercer was the kind of man people gravitated toward. At 32, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had worked hard and succeeded, but without flaunting his wealth. Tall and lean, with dark, brown hair that always seemed slightly tousled. He had an easy charm and sharp, kind eyes that put people at ease. Elliot wasn't driven by greed or the hunger for status. He simply had a knack for numbers and an instinct for timing. His success in the stock market came from careful analysis, endless patience, and a bit of luck. But despite his financial success, Elliot was modest. His main indulgences were a good book, a warm coffee, and a quiet life. Though he was successful, Elliot often felt restless. He longed for something tangible, something he could see and touch as a result of his efforts. That's what drew him to the idea of buying a home, one he could transform into his own haven. When Elliot found the listing for the house on Oak Hollow, it felt like fate. The property wasn't far from the bustling city he worked in, yet it was secluded enough to offer peace and solitude. It was a big house, not quite a manor, but substantial in size, perched on a hill with a cellar and an old pond at its edge. It needed repairs, but Elliot saw potential. Little did he know, the house would demand more than just his attention. It would take pieces of him he wasn't prepared to give. Elliot arrived at the small office of Mrs. Holloway, the estate agent, handling the property. The room smelled faintly of mothballs and old wood. Mrs. Holloway, a woman in her late 50s with sharp features and a neatly tied bun, sat behind an oversized oak desk, reviewing papers. "Ah, Mr. Mercer," she greeted, standing to shake his hand. Her handshake was firm, her crimson lipstick giving her an almost theatrical appearance. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Holloway," Elliot replied warmly, his voice filled with the natural charm he carried. She gestured for him to sit. "So, you're the buyer for the house on Oak Hollow. You're certain about this purchase?" Elliot smiled easily. "Absolutely. It needs some work, but I think it's worth the effort." Mrs. Holloway tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It's not every day we find someone so enthusiastic. May I ask what drew you to it?" Elliot shrugged. "It has character, potential. I've always wanted a place where I could leave my mark." "Potential," she echoed thoughtfully. "Yes, that's one way to put it." Her hesitation didn't go unnoticed. "Is there something I should know?" he asked, leaning forward. Mrs. Holloway hesitated for a moment before, waving a hand dismissively. "Oh, nothing of real importance. Just the usual nonsense that comes with older houses. You know, ghost stories, curses, tragic pasts. People love to talk." Elliot chuckled. "I'm not the superstitious type." Her lips tightened into a thin smile. "Good. But just to confirm, you've read all the disclosures? About the cellar's dampness, the pond, and the peculiarities of the property?" "I have." "Well then," she said, standing and extending her hand again. "Welcome to Oak Hollow." A few days later, Elliot met Arthur Gray, the previous owner of the house. Arthur was frail, his thin frame swallowed by the large wheelchair he sat in. The nursing home lounge was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of antiseptic and old fabric. "So," Arthur said, his voice raspy, "you're the brave soul who's taking on the house." "It seemed like a good investment," Elliot replied cautiously, "though I wanted to hear about it from someone who lived there." Arthur's green eyes burned with an unsettling intensity. "Investment? Is that what you think it is? A good deal?" Elliot shifted uncomfortably. "I don't follow." The old man laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "That house isn't a home, boy. It's a predator. It'll take from you, just like it took from me. You think you own it now, but it's the other way around." "What do you mean?" Elliot pressed, his unease growing. Arthur leaned forward, his bony fingers gripping the armrests of his chair. "It's hungry, Always hungry. When you hear the splashing, you'll know. Before Elliot could ask more, a nurse wheeled Arthur away. As he was pushed toward the door, Arthur turned back, his voice rising in a final warning. You've already given it a piece of yourself, and it'll want more. Late one night, Elliot lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, but his mind wouldn't settle. Then it came. Splash! Elliot bolted upright. The sound came again. Splash! Splash! It was coming from the pond. Throwing on a jacket, he grabbed his flashlight and headed outside. The air was cold, and the grass was damp beneath his feet. At the pond's edge, the water was eerily still. Yet the splashing sound persisted, as if something invisible was thrashing about. He shone his flashlight across the surface, and for a moment he thought he saw movement, a ripple that didn't match the wind. Then his reflection appeared, distorted and wrong. It leaned closer, its smile stretching unnaturally wide. Elliot stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from his hand. The sound of a scream pierced the air, high and guttural, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He ran back to the house, locking the doors behind him, his heart pounding in his chest. The next morning, Elliot woke with a sense of unease that lingered from the previous night. He couldn't shake the memory of the distorted reflection or the scream. To distract himself, he decided to focus on renovations. He spent the day repairing the shutters, patching up the floorboards, and painting the walls. The physical work grounded him, and for a while the house felt normal, just a project he was fixing up. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the unease crept back in, seeping into the corners of the house. That evening there was a knock at the door. When Elliot opened it, a cheerful couple stood on the porch. "Welcome to the neighborhood," boomed Tom, a burly man with an oversized grin. He handed Elliot a basket of freshly baked bread. His wife, Marcy, tall and wiry with curly blonde hair, added, "We just had to stop by and say hello. Not many people move out here." "Thank you," Elliot said, accepting the basket. "Do you live nearby?" Tom chuckled. "Nearby? Not exactly. We're a good 10 miles down the road, but neighbors are neighbors. Especially out. Here," Marcy added with a laugh, a high-pitched, almost manic sound that lingered uncomfortably. Elliot smiled politely. "Well, it's nice to meet you both. I appreciate the welcome." Tom's grin widened. "Brave, moving into a place like this." "Brave?" Elliot asked, his brow furrowing. "Oh, don't mind him," Marcy interjected quickly, her laughter cutting the tension. "It's just that people around here love to tell stories about this house. Old places always come with a bit of history." Their laughter filled the air, loud and overlapping, almost too cheerful. Elliot forced a smile, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. "Well," Marcy said, finally catching her breath, "we won't keep you. Just wanted to say hi, but we'll be back. We always make time for new friends." As they walked away, their laughter echoed down the long, empty road, lingering in the air long after they disappeared into the distance. A few days later, Elliot received a letter from his office. He wasn't expecting anything, so he opened it cautiously. The paper was slightly damp, the ink smudged in places, but the message was clear. "We're granting you a temporary leave of absence for a month. Rest up, recharge, and return to us refreshed." He frowned. He hadn't requested time off. He checked his phone but found no missed calls or emails about the matter. It was strange, but perhaps his manager had noticed his stress and decided to give him a break. Still, the dampness of the letter nagged at him. It felt wrong, as if the house itself was conspiring to keep him there. Elliot decided to celebrate his purchase with a small housewarming party. He invited a few friends from the city, keeping the gathering low-key. The group mingled in the living room, sipping wine and admiring the house's potential. Elliot had worked hard to make the main rooms presentable, and his friends complimented the improvements. "This place is amazing. one of them said. It's got so much character. Elliot smiled, but his eyes flickered to the windows. The night outside seemed darker than usual, the trees swaying in a wind he couldn't hear. The evening passed without incident, though Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't entirely alone. A week later, Elliot's parents visited, for dinner. His mother, a petite woman with silver hair and a warm demeanor, immediately began fussing over him. "You've lost weight," she said, her sharp eyes scanning his face. "Are you eating enough?" "Mom, I'm fine," Elliot replied, setting the table. His father, a tall man with a quiet disposition, inspected the house with a craftsman's eye. "This place has potential," he said, "but you've got your work cut out for you." The dinner was pleasant, filled with laughter and stories of Elliot's childhood. For a few hours, the house felt warm, the shadows retreating as his parents' presence filled the space. After they left, Elliot stood by the window, watching their car disappear down the road. The warmth lingered for a moment, but as the night closed in, so did the house. Elliot met Claire on a Thursday night. They had connected through mutual friends, and he was excited about the date. She was charming, with auburn hair and a quick wit that matched his own. They had dinner at the house, Elliot cooking a simple but delicious meal. The conversation flowed easily, and Claire seemed genuinely interested in the house and its history. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Elliot lit a fire. The warmth of the flames created a cozy atmosphere, but the faint sound of splashing from the pond outside broke the spell. "Do you hear that?" Claire asked, her brow furrowing. "It's just the pond," Elliot said quickly, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. Claire gave him a curious look, but didn't press further. When she left that night, she kissed him on the cheek and promised to see him again. Elliot watched her car disappear down the driveway, his unease growing as the house seemed to settle, back into its brooding silence. Elliot had taken to showering instead of bathing. Something about lying down in water made him feel too vulnerable, too exposed. One evening, as the hot water poured over him, he began to hum absent-mindedly. "Row, row, row your boat." He froze, the tune catching him off guard. He hadn't thought of that song in years. Then, from the corner of the bathroom, a radio crackled to life. "Row, row, row your boat," a distorted voice sang, mimicking his tune. Elliot's heart pounded. The radio wasn't even plugged in. As the song reached its end, a blood-curdling scream burst from the speakers, sending chills down his spine. He stumbled out of the shower, water pooling at his feet. The radio fell silent, the room eerily still. Elliot couldn't shake the fear that the house was turning against him. Every shadow seemed alive, every creak a warning. The air grew heavier each night, pressing down on him as though the house itself was watching. The cellar door became an obsession. It loomed at the end of the hallway, always slightly ajar as if daring him to enter. Elliot tried to ignore it, but his dreams were filled with visions of dark waters and unseen hands pulling him down. One evening, after a restless day of repairs and avoidance, Elliot decided to confront his fears. Armed with a flashlight and a wrench for comfort, he descended into the cellar. The steps groaned beneath his weight, the air growing colder with each step. The stone walls were slick with moisture, and the faint smell of decay grew stronger the deeper he went. At the bottom, the flashlight's beam revealed an expansive space, its stone floor cracked and uneven. The trickling sound of water echoed, softly, and his light caught a glimmering puddle in the center of the room. He approached it cautiously. The puddle was perfectly circular, its surface unnaturally still despite the faint dripping sound coming from somewhere in the darkness. As Elliot crouched to inspect it, the water began to ripple. He froze, watching as the ripples grew into small waves. Then, from the center, a tiny wooden toy boat floated to the surface, its paint peeling and faded. "Row, row, row your boat." The voice was soft, almost childlike, and it echoed around him. Elliot spun around, the flashlight shaking in his hands. The cellar was empty. "Row, row, row your boat," the voice repeated, louder now, overlapping with itself. The ripples in the puddle turned into violent splashes, water spilling onto the stone floor. Then, from the cracks in the walls, something began to emerge. Pale, skeletal fingers clawed at the stone, followed by a grotesque, waterlogged face. Its eyes were hollow, its jaw unhinged as it dragged itself forward. Elliot stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. In the sudden darkness, the only sound was the creature's labored breathing and the wet slap of its limbs against the floor. Panicking, he scrambled up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind him. His heart pounded as he pressed his back against the door, listening for any sound from below. For a moment there was silence. Then, splash, splash! The sound came again, this time closer, as if it were moving through the walls. He fled to his bedroom, locking the door and huddling in the corner. The night stretched on endlessly, every shadow and creak amplified by his fear. The next morning, Elliot woke to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. The house was quiet, almost serene. But the cellar door was wide open. Elliot knew he couldn't stay. The house had taken something from him, his peace, his sense of safety. And it would only take more if he remained. Over the next few days, he packed his belongings, ignoring the strange occurrences that continued to plague him. Doors that wouldn't stay shut. The faint sound of splashing water even in the driest rooms. And always, the song, soft, mocking, and unrelenting. As he loaded the last of his boxes into his car, he glanced back at the house. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching him. He turned away, refusing to look again. Driving away from Oak Hollow, Elliot felt a weight lift from his chest. But as he reached the edge of the property, his radio crackled to life. "Row, row, row your boat." Elliot's grip tightened on the steering wheel as the familiar voice sang, gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 merrily. The song faded, replaced by static. Then came the scream, loud and piercing, drowning out everything else. Elliot slammed on the brakes, his car skidding to a halt. He turned the radio off and sat in silence, his heart racing. The road ahead was empty, but in the rearview mirror, the house stood tall on the hill, its dark windows staring back at him like hollow eyes. He drove on, determined to leave it behind. But deep down he knew he hadn't left the house. The house had followed him. Google form in the description, it must be longer than 8,000 characters.